Do you believe in legends? Not the ones told to scare children, but those that carry a dark weight, a secret so unsettling that no one dares to investigate deeply? Today, we'll dive into the murky waters of a forgotten place in Louisiana, where, they say, a distorted laughter echoes on moonless nights. The swamp clown is just a story. Or is it? Who's ready to uncover the truth? But beware, some mysteries are better left buried. Ready to continue? The Louisiana swamps held a peculiar silence, almost threatening. When the wind blew, it seemed to whisper stories no one wanted to hear. It was there, in the heart of the dark waters and mist-shrouded cypresses, that the village of Bellefontaine lay hidden, a small cluster of decaying homes, forgotten by time and progress. The village had a strange rule. No one left their house after sunset. The few streets were swallowed by darkness, and only flickering gas lamps in locked windows lit the night. Leah Dupré, a journalist from New Orleans, arrived in Bellefontaine late in the afternoon, driving an old, creaky truck that groaned with every turn. She'd heard rumors about the swamp clown while working on a story about urban legends for an investigative blog. But the stories were vague, and the few people she'd asked refused to talk about it. With a mix of professional curiosity and mild disdain for local superstitions, she decided to investigate on her own. In the town's rundown bar, the only place that seemed alive, she ordered a cheap beer and started chatting with the locals. "I'm looking for information about the clown legend," she said casually. The bar fell silent. Every person present avoided meeting her gaze, their eyes darting to tables, walls, anywhere but the curious face of the journalist. An old man, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes, broke the silence with a sigh. "You shouldn't mess with that, miss. Some things are better left alone." His name was Ezekiel, and unlike the others, he seemed more weary than scared. Despite the furious looks from the rest of the crowd, he continued, "The clown story isn't just a legend. He's here, still prowling the swamp. The children disappeared because of him. The laughter, you don't want to hear the laughter." Intrigued, Leah pressed further. "But it's just a story, right? Something made up to scare kids?" Ezekiel shook his head slowly. "That's what I thought too, until I heard the laughter. One night, just once. I've never gone out after dark since." Before she could ask more, a robust woman behind the bar, likely the owner, cut in. "That's enough. You're not bringing that curse back here." The tension in the air was almost tangible, but Leah realized the resistance only fueled her curiosity. She decided she had to go into the swamp alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she grabbed her flashlight and recorder, driving to the edge of the water. The night consumed the area, and the mist spread like pale fingers, pulling her into the labyrinth of twisted trees and muddy water. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of something moving in the water. She documented everything into her recorder, describing the eerie environment in detail, trying to ignore the chill creeping down her spine. Suddenly, something shattered the silence, a low, muffled sound like a child's laughter. Leah froze. "Hello? Is someone there?" She tried to convince herself it was the wind, but the sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the swamp. It was a distorted laughter, deep and high-pitched at the same time, as if someone had tried to mimic a child's joy, but failed in a grotesque way. Leah kept moving, though every cell in her body screamed for her to turn back. Then something reflected her flashlight, a mask half buried in the mud, with a smeared red smile and hollow eyes that seemed to follow her. She crouched to pick it up, but before her fingers touched it, the laughter came again. This time, directly behind her, she spun around quickly but saw nothing, only the swamp, only the darkness. "Is someone there?" Her voice trembled. The only reply was a closer sound, the splash of feet moving through the water, and then more laughter. This time, multiple voices. Leah was frozen in place. The sound of multiple laughs surrounded her, coming from different directions. The flashlight trembled in her hand, casting grotesque shadows across the trees. "Who's there?" she repeated, trying to sound firm, but her voice cracked at the end. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, as though dozens of eyes were staring at her from the darkness. The splashing in the water continued, growing closer with each passing second. She started to back away, but tripped over a submerged root, nearly falling. The flashlight wobbled, casting light on something that made her swallow hard. Small handprints, red like blood, stained one of the trees ahead. They looked fresh, glistening under the flickering beam of her light. Her breath quickened, her chest tightening. "I need to get out of here," she muttered to herself, trying to convince herself this was just some cruel prank by a local. But the laughter, that laughter didn't sound human. It carried something deeper, as though it were mocking her sanity directly. Leah began to run, ignoring the sound of snapping branches beneath her feet and the rustling vegetation around her. With every step, the laughter seemed to follow, echoing through the trees. The mask she'd seen earlier was burned into her mind, the grotesque smile etched onto her memory. But something caught her attention as she passed a partially submerged log, a piece of fabric striped red and white. She stopped, hesitating, and pulled the fabric free. It was part of a coat, weathered and caked with mud. Beside it lay a small rag doll, crudely stitched, with a face haphazardly sewn and a smile made of thick black thread. A shiver ran down Leah's spine. "This can't be real." Suddenly, a heavy sound rippled through the water around her. It was no longer the sound of small footsteps. It was something bigger, stronger, moving with intent. She swung her flashlight toward the noise, but the beam seemed powerless against the thick fog. Still, the sound persisted, growing closer. By the moment, "Come out! Whoever you are, come out!" Leah shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. The only reply was the sound of something crashing into the water with force, as if it had dived in or was hiding. She aimed her flashlight at the swamp's surface and saw small bubbles rising, a clear sign that something was just below. As she slowly backed away, her mind raced to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal. But no animal could mimic laughter, especially not like this. Then something emerged from the water in front of her. It was fast, just a blur, but the light caught enough. A pale figure with a grotesque smile painted on its face. Leah let out a scream and broke into a run again, her flashlight swinging wildly, casting erratic beams through the swamp. Behind her, the laughter resumed, louder this time, and now accompanied by a warped melody, like a broken wind-up toy. "This isn't real. It's not real," she kept repeating, but the terror was evident in her voice. When she finally spotted her truck, a wave of relief swept over her. She sprinted toward it, unlocking the door and diving inside. She locked the doors quickly and fumbled to start the engine, but the motor sputtered and died. "Not now, please, not now!" She turned the key frantically, desperation in every motion, while the laughter grew louder, more suffocating. Suddenly, a loud thud on the truck's roof made her freeze. Something, or someone, was on top of it. The laughter now came from all directions, as if the shadows of the swamp had come alive. Leah couldn't move, her eyes fixed on the windshield, waiting for the inevitable. Then slowly, a pale, elongated hand slid down the glass. It was inhuman, the fingers far too long, with cracked, filthy nails. The hand began to draw circles on the glass, while the laughter crescendoed into a warped, deafening cacophony. Finally, with one last desperate turn of the key, the engine roared to life. Leah slammed her foot on the gas, mud spraying in every direction as the truck lurched forward. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The figure stood in the middle of the road, motionless, its painted smile seemingly stretching wider as she sped away. But that wasn't all. The figure raised a hand and waved at her. Leah drove down the dirt road, with trembling hands gripping the wheel, her heart pounding uncontrollably. The rearview mirror seemed to pull at her, as though it was impossible not to check if the figure was still following her. Every quick glance revealed nothing but the empty road and the oppressive darkness of the swamp. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, like an invisible shadow clinging to her back. As the truck's engine roared against the slick, muddy terrain, Leah tried to organize her thoughts. "This can't be real. It's exhaustion, or maybe some cruel prank," she repeated to herself, almost like a mantra. But the laughter still echoed in her memory, and the image of that grotesque hand on her windshield felt branded into her mind. The road began to widen, and in the distance, she spotted what looked like a small wooden house, illuminated by a dim, yellow light. She had no idea who lived there, but she needed help. Without hesitation, she turned the wheel and parked the truck with a sharp motion. She stepped out, glancing cautiously around, and ran to the porch of the house. She pounded on the door, nearly shouting, "Please, is anyone there? I need help." The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps from the other side of the door made her heart race. When the door finally creaked open, it revealed a thin, elderly man with tired eyes and a scruffy beard. He looked at her with suspicion, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing here at this hour?" the man asked, his voice raspy and heavy with a thick local drawl. Leah tried to explain, but her words tumbled out in a rush. I was in the swamp. Something followed me. There's something out there. It's real, I saw it." The man stayed silent for a moment, studying her with a look that was part curiosity, part concern. Finally, he opened the door wider and motioned for her to come inside. "Get in, quick. It's not safe out there." Leah stepped inside without hesitation, feeling a momentary sense of relief in the house's warmth, though her mind remained on high alert. The house was small and cluttered with old items. Black and white photos hung on the walls, wooden furniture, worn with age, and a persistent smell of tobacco and coffee. The man gestured toward a chair and headed to the kitchen, where he began preparing what looked like tea. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Him? What? The clown?" Leah replied, barely believing the words she was saying. The man shook his head slowly. "It's not a clown. Not really. That's just what it wants you to see. It takes forms. Forms that scare you, but it always leaves that smile, like a signature. A shiver ran down Leah's spine. Then what is it? Why is it here? The man placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her and sat down in the opposite chair. It's something old, real old. Folks around here call it the swamp laugh. They say it shows up for those who dare to go where they shouldn't. First it watches, then it plays, and then... He paused, staring at the floor as if the next words were too heavy to say. It takes. Leah gripped the cup with trembling hands. But why? What does it want? The man let out a deep sigh. Some say it used to be a person, a tortured soul, who met a cruel death in the swamp. Others think it's something worse, something that's always been here, feeding off fear. All I know is it never stops until it gets what it wants. Before Leah could ask more, a knock on the window made her nearly drop the cup. She turned quickly but saw nothing outside except the darkness. The man stood slowly, picking up his shotgun. It knows you're here. The two remained silent. There, eyes locked on the window. Then the laughter returned. It was distant at first, but quickly grew louder, surrounding the house like an invisible tide. It was sharper, more intense now, almost unbearable. Leah felt her heart race again, and a creeping sense of despair began to overwhelm her. "Don't let it in," the man said, his eyes fixed on the door. "No matter what you hear, no matter what it does, don't open the door." Leah nodded silently, unable to find her voice. The laughter continued, but now it was accompanied by knocks. On the door, the walls, the roof. They came from everywhere all at once. Then a thin, childlike voice echoed from outside. "Mommy, are you there? I'm lost." Leah felt the blood drain from her face. She knew it was impossible, but the voice sounded exactly like her young niece's, the same niece who had gone missing years ago. Leah remained frozen, the voice outside cutting through the silence like a blade. "Mommy, please help me. It's so dark out here." It was impossible, but the tone of the voice was perfect, an innocent plea, filled with despair. It was Emily's voice, her niece, who had mysteriously disappeared when she was only 6 years old. "This can't be real," Leah whispered, clutching the teacup with trembling hands. She glanced at the man, who stood with his shotgun pointed at the door. His expression was one of pure dread, but also firm resolve. "Don't listen. He's playing with you," the man said, his voice low but commanding. Without realizing it, Leah started to rise, drawn toward the voice outside. What if it's her? What if... Memories of Emily flooded her mind. Her laughter, their afternoons playing together, and the emptiness left by her disappearance, which had never been explained. The voice now sounded closer. "Please, I'm scared." Before Leah could take another step toward the door, the man barked, "Stop!" He reached out and grabbed her arm firmly. "Look at me, girl. He knows what haunts you. He'll use it against you. It's not real." The man's words felt distant, muffled by the voice outside, which now sobbed quietly. Leah wanted to believe him, but her heart waged war against her mind. What if there was a chance, a small chance that Emily was out there, needing her help? Suddenly, the knocking resumed, but this time it was more violent. Each blow against the door made the entire house tremble. The man gripped the shotgun tightly, aiming it at the entrance, his eyes locked on the door. "You have to be stronger than him. If you open that door, you're done for." Tears streamed down Leah's face, mingling with the cold sweat on her skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were rooted to the floor. The voice outside shifted, becoming darker, more drawn out. "Why won't you help me, Leah? You left me alone." It sounded like Emily was blaming her, as though it was her fault. The guilt Leah had carried for years swelled like a tidal wave, crushing her. Her chest tightened as memories surged forward. The day Emily vanished, and the overwhelming sense that she could have done more. I can't ignore this," she whispered, almost to herself. The man stepped closer, positioning himself between her and the door. "Listen, girl. I've seen him do this before. He takes what you want most, what you're most afraid of losing, and uses it to pull you in. No matter what you hear, no matter what he says, don't open that damn door." The laughter returned, but this time it was tangled with the sound of crying. It was unnatural, like two voices speaking at once. Leah covered her ears, but it was no use. The sound seemed to come from inside her own head, and then abruptly everything went silent. No laughter, no crying, not even the wind outside. Only the ticking of the clock in the kitchen marked the passage of time. The man lowered his shotgun slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the door. This isn't good. When he goes quiet, that's when it gets worse. Before Leah could ask what he meant, the lights in the house began to flicker, casting shifting, eerie shadows across the walls. One by one, the bulbs burst, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint beam of Leah's flashlight resting on the table remained, and then came a new knock, but not on the door. It came from the window behind them. Leah spun around, and for a brief moment she saw it, a face pressed against the glass. The grin was wide, grotesque, almost splitting the pale mask it wore. The black, soulless eyes bored into her, as if reaching into the depths of her being. "He's here," the man said, his voice thick with fear and resignation. He raised the shotgun, but before he could act, the window shattered inward, shards of glass raining down on the room. The flashlight's beam flickered once, and then died, leaving them in complete darkness. In the blackness, Leah heard only the sound of laughter, louder, closer, and this time coming from inside the house. The darkness was absolute, so dense that Leah couldn't see a thing, not even her own hands. The laughter filled every corner of the house, reverberating like a distorted, chaotic melody. It seemed to move, now from the ceiling, now from the walls, and at times so close she could almost feel it on her skin. "Leah, stay with me." The man's voice broke through the chaos, but was quickly drowned out by a violent crash. Something had hit the floor hard. She tried to call out to him, but her voice was weak, crushed by the terror gripping her. "Sir, are you there?" A heavy silence filled the room for a moment, only to be broken by a chilling whisper, far too close to her ear. "Leah!" It was the same voice that had mimicked Emily, but now it was darker, drawn out, like it was spoken through a throat clogged with mud. She scrambled back, tripping over a chair and falling onto the wooden floor. Her breathing was erratic, verging on hyperventilation. Her fingers found the flashlight, and with trembling hands she fumbled to turn it on. After several frantic clicks, the beam finally flickered to life, casting a weak light around the room. The man was on the floor, unconscious, the shotgun lying beside him. But what caught her attention was something on the opposite wall. There were small handprints, just like the ones she'd seen in the swamp. But now they were spreading, staining the wood, as though something invisible was trying to force its Way inside, she crawled to the man and shook him, desperate to wake him. "Please, wake up. We need to get out of here." But he didn't respond. His eyes were open but glassy, staring blankly, as if he were seeing something she couldn't. It was as if his mind had been ripped away, leaving only an empty shell behind. Before Leah could process what was happening, something moved at the edge of the flashlight's beam. A blur, quick and sinuous, darted behind her. She instinctively turned, but there was nothing there. "Show yourself!" she shouted, but her voice sounded weak, lost amid the laughter that began echoing once more. Suddenly the flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she saw it. He was standing in the corner of the room, his form partially obscured by shadow. He was larger than she had imagined, his body grotesque and misshapen, his posture twisted, as though every movement was an awkward attempt to mimic humanity. His face, or whatever it was hidden behind the clown mask. The painted smile was wider now, distorted, as if it had stretched far beyond the mask's edges. His eyes, black and hollow, seemed to pierce straight into her soul. And then he took a step forward. Leah scrambled backward, dragging herself along the floor, reaching for the shotgun lying beside the man. The clown didn't run. He moved slowly, each step accompanied by a muffled sound, like water dripping. The laughter was quieter now, almost a murmur, but it was more unsettling than ever. Finally, her hand found the cold metal of the shotgun. With all her strength, she lifted it, aiming it at the figure. "Don't come any closer," she screamed, but he kept advancing, undeterred, as if her words were meaningless. She pulled the trigger. The deafening explosion of the gunshot echoed through the house, and the figure was thrown backward, collapsing into a dark corner. The silence that followed was deafening. Leah remained frozen, panting, her ears ringing from the blast. But the silence didn't last. A gurgling sound emerged from the corner where the figure had fallen. Leah shone the flashlight toward the sound, and her heart nearly stopped. He was still there, but now the mask had fallen off, revealing something far worse. The face was a grotesque mix of flesh and mud, its features undefined, as though they were half-formed. But the smile remained, larger than ever, stretching grotesquely across the warped skin. The eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto hers, gleaming like tiny beacons in the dark. Before she could react, he began to rise again, every movement accompanied by sickening cracks, like bones breaking and rearranging themselves. "You can't run from me, Leah." His voice echoed, and this time she was certain. He had known her name all along. She screamed, the sound primal and raw, as the figure advanced toward her. Leah's scream echoed through the house, but it seemed to vanish into the distorted laughter that now filled every corner. She crawled backward across the floor, her eyes locked on the thing approaching her. Every grotesque movement, every step it took was accompanied by a wet, squelching sound. "You can't run, you never could," the voice repeated, distorted, reverberating as if it were echoing inside her skull. Clutching the shotgun, Leah fired again. The deafening shot rang out, and the figure staggered, slamming into the wall. But this time she didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, yanking at the handle with all her strength. The wood groaned, but refused to budge. "No, not now," she cried, slamming her shoulder against it. Behind her, the laughter began again, deeper, louder, as though the creature was enjoying her struggle. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw it rising once more, but now something had changed. Its misshapen flesh seemed to be shifting, stretching unnaturally. The smile, ever present, was growing wider, almost consuming its entire face. Desperate, Leah grabbed a rusted padlock hanging near the door and began smashing it against the latch. Each blow felt like an eternity, the metallic clang echoing through the oppressive silence. Finally, the lock gave way and the door flew open, revealing the pitch-black swamp beyond. Without thinking, she ran into the night, plunging into the swamp's suffocating darkness. The vegetation was thick, branches and roots tugging at her. Feet, as if the very ground was conspiring to trap her. The flashlight swung wildly in her hand, its erratic beam cutting through the fog. For a brief moment, all she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the crunch of her footsteps in the mud. But then the laughter returned, louder this time, closer. Leah spun around, shining the light back toward the house, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that made her ears throb. "This isn't real. This isn't real," she whispered, trying to keep herself together. Suddenly, the flashlight's beam caught something up ahead, an old structure nearly swallowed by the overgrown swamp. It looked like an abandoned cabin, its sagging walls warped by time and nature. With no other choice, Leah ran toward it, shoving the fragile door open so hard it nearly came off its hinges. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, a mix of mold, wet earth, and something metallic. The flashlight's weak glow revealed grotesque drawings on the walls, smiling faces all warped, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow her. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, and sitting on it was a rag doll, eerily similar to the one she'd found in the swamp earlier. She approached it cautiously, each step feeling heavier, the air pressing down on her like a physical weight. When the flashlight fully illuminated the doll, she noticed something clutched in its sewn hand, a small, cracked mirror. Leah hesitated but reached out and took the mirror. As she lifted it, her breath caught in her throat. Reflected in the glass was something that made her blood run cold. Behind her, the figure stood, but it was different now. Larger, more monstrous, its flesh glistening as though wet. The grotesque smile had stretched impossibly wide, nearly splitting its head in two. Its black, soulless eyes locked onto hers through the mirror, and in that moment she felt a chill unlike any she'd ever known, an unbearable sensation that something inside her was being torn away. She spun around, but the creature was gone. The laughter, however, wasn't. It filled the cabin once more, joined by a low, repetitive sound, a warped melody, like a music box playing far too slowly. Leah frantically searched the room with her flashlight, desperate to find the source of the sound. Then she realized the mirror in her hand no longer reflected the cabin. Instead, it showed a distorted version of herself, her face twisted into the same grotesque grin as the creature's. Her eyes were black, empty, devoid of anything human. Panicking, she tried to drop the mirror, but it wouldn't budge. It felt fused to her hand as if it were a part of her now. "You're already mine, Leah," the voice echoed, and this time it didn't come from outside, it came from within her. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, while the reflection in the mirror began to move on its own, grinning mockingly at her. Leah stumbled backward, the mirror still fused to her hand as if it were part of her flesh. Every attempt to pry it loose sent searing pain through her arm, as though she was tearing away something far deeper than just skin. The smile in the reflection was now larger than her own face, curling impossibly wide, as if it wanted to devour her whole. "Get out of my head!" she screamed, hurling the mirror against the wall with all her strength. It shattered into countless pieces, but instead of silence, the laughter grew louder, reverberating through the tiny cabin. Now it was everywhere, coming from all directions, accompanied by a steady pounding rhythm, like an invisible drum marking the beat of something inevitable. Her flashlight flickered, its light struggling to stay on, until it illuminated something that made Leah's stomach churn. Every shard of the broken mirror reflected not the inside of the cabin, but dozens of grinning figures, their empty black eyes staring back at her. They stood motionless, yet their smiles seemed to grow wider with each passing second. Leah staggered out of the cabin, tripping over the muck and roots, the sound of the laughter pursuing her like a predator. "Run, Leah!" The man's voice echoed in her memory, though he was nowhere to be found. She ran without direction, without thought, the swamp closing in around her as branches and roots clawed at her legs like hands rising from the earth. But something was wrong. No matter how far she ran, she always ended up back in the same spot. The twisted trees, the suffocating vegetation, and the endless mud formed a shifting maze that held her captive. Her breaths were ragged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just let me go," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness, and then she saw it. In the center of a small clearing ahead lay the clown mask. Partially buried in the mud, its painted red smile still visible, it seemed to call to her, a promise of something unspeakable. Against all her instincts, Leah approached it. As she reached down with trembling hands and picked up the mask, the laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the swamp into a suffocating, deathly silence. The mask was cold to the touch, and as she held it, she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned. There it was, the monstrous figure now fully revealed. It was an unholy amalgamation of human and inhuman, its flesh warped and shaped by something that didn't understand humanity. Its grotesque smile stretched impossibly wide across its face, and its black, glimmering eyes burned with an insatiable hunger. "You can't escape, Leah," its voice echoed, but this time it didn't come just from the creature. It came from the swamp, from the ground beneath her feet, and even from within her own body. "Why? What do you want from me?" Leah screamed, clutching the mask as if it were a weapon. The figure tilted its head, the smile growing even larger. I want what you carry. The fear, the guilt, the emptiness, that's what feeds me." Her voice barely came out as a whisper. "You can't have me." Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Leah hurled the mask toward the creature. The moment it hit the ground, the swamp seemed to tremble, as if the land itself had come alive. The figure froze, staring at the mask. The laughter ceased, and for a moment everything was still. But then the ground beneath Leah's feet began to crack, as though something massive was trying to rise from below. She tried to run, but the roots and muck started to pull her down, wrapping around her legs like living chains. "No! No!" The last sound she heard before being swallowed by the swamp was the distorted laughter, now faint, almost a whisper. When Leah opened her eyes, she was back in the swamp. But something was different. She was alone. Her flashlight had gone out, but the faint reflection in the water caught her attention. It was enough to make her shiver. She was wearing the clown mask. The last thing she saw before her consciousness faded was her own reflection, smiling back at her, its grotesque, impossible grin stretching wider and wider. Weeks later, a group of fishermen found Leah's truck abandoned near the swamp. Small red handprints were smeared across the hood, and a faint laughter seemed to echo among the trees. There was no sign of her anywhere. But at night, locals say, they can still hear the laughter, and sometimes on moonless nights they catch a glimpse of a figure with a wide, unnatural smile wandering among the trees. If this story sent chills down your spine and took you to the edge of the unknown, just imagine what else we have waiting in the shadows. Here, every click is a door to the unexpected. Every subscription a step deeper into the abyss of psychological terror. Subscribe now and join the brave few who dare to explore the darkest corners of imagination, because in the end, the real fear is being left out. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks or adjustments.